Oh, her decisions. Today, however, as she sifted through the folder marked Rhodes, Claudia felt a ripple under her composure. She saw the familiar statistics, placed in foster care at age 4, 7 different homes, no record of biological family, and felt strangely as if something personal was at stake. She brushed it off. There were dozens of cases, dozens of children, every story unique but each one blending together, eventually, in her memory. The caseworker, Ms. Kendrick, stood and began to read from her notes. Micah has shown remarkable resilience despite instability. He is quiet, well-behaved, does not disrupt, but has not formed strong attachments. His current placement with Mr. and Mrs. Delaney is considered stable. They are interested in adoption, pending today's proceedings. Claudia's eyes drifted from the words to the boy himself. He did not look at Ms. Kendrick or at the Delaneys, who sat stiffly, hands clasped, fear and hope flickering in their eyes. Micah was staring at the judge, his expression not pleading or defiant, but searching. The lawyers took over, and the room dissolved into a slow dance of arguments and rebuttals. The best interests of the child, one began, while the other countered, permanent placement must be prioritized. Claudia let their voices wash over her. She had heard it all before, but in the silences, she found her gaze drawn again and again to Micah. He was too still, too focused, as if he were waiting for something extraordinary to happen. It was not the sort of morning that signaled the breaking of worlds. Yet in a heartbeat, everything changed. When the attorneys paused, waiting for the judge's summary, Micah spoke. "Excuse me, Judge," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but the effect was as if he'd shouted. Conversation froze. Every eye snapped toward the boy. Claudia, startled, set down her pen. "Yes, Micah," she said, striving for warmth, for the tone adults use when talking to lost children. He stood. His knees shook. His hands trembled, but his eyes held steady. "You're my mom," he said. The words landed in the room with the weight of a verdict. For a split second, time did not move. 100 heartbeats stumbled. Ms. Kendrick's hand flew to her mouth. The Delaneys stared, open-mouthed. The attorneys looked as if they'd been slapped. Judge Monroe felt as if she'd been struck in the chest. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her training warred with her instincts. Her world, built on control and reason, suddenly cracked. "Micah," she managed, her voice barely audible. That's not, this isn't the time." But Micah's face was earnest, his small body tense as a drawn bow. "I'm not lying. I know you are. I found your name. I know what you did." Whispers exploded around the courtroom, harsh and fast. "Is he serious? How could he know? That's not possible." One of the attorneys rose, sputtering. "Your Honor, may I request—" Claudia raised a trembling hand, and the room fell silent. The bailiff, usually unmoved by any display, actually took a step closer, ready to intervene. But there was no anger in the boy, only something desperate and determined. I need to ask, how did you—" Claudia began, but her voice was thin. She could not look away from Micah's eyes. In them, she saw not just accusation, but longing, an ancient hunger that was not only for answers, but for belonging. "After my last foster home," Micah said, the words tumbling out in a rush, "I found papers. Some were about me, some about you. I saw your name, Claudia Monroe, and when I saw you, I just knew." There was no drama in his tone, no plea for attention. It was a simple statement, as natural as breathing. But the simplicity was what undid her. Claudia felt herself slipping back into a memory so deeply buried it had almost grown roots inside her. She was 19 again, scared and broke, sitting in the dim light of a hospital room, a tiny baby swaddled in her arms. Her parents had been cold, her friends distant. There had been no money, no plan, no hope. And so, with tears streaming down her face, she had signed the papers. She'd told herself it was for the best. He would have a better life. She would never look back. Except now, the past was staring her down, 10 years old, full of questions she had never dared to answer. For a long moment, no one moved. The lawyers exchanged glances. Should they object? Should they offer comfort? But even they seemed frozen by the boy's quiet certainty. Finally, Claudia gathered herself, every muscle in her body screaming to run. Micah, she said, her voice trembling with a kind of awe. Sometimes people see what they want to see. I am your judge, not your... But Micah shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. Number, you're my mom. I know it. I know you're the one who left me, but you're also the only one who can tell me why. The room pulsed with a rawness no law could contain. The Delaney's wept quietly. The court reporter's hands hovered, not typing, simply witnessing. Claudia felt the whole edifice of her career, her reputation, her life, everything she had constructed out of order and logic, start to tremble. There was something in her heart, something she had starved for so long, that now ached to reach across the gulf of years and answer the boy's cry. Court will recess, she whispered, not trusting herself to say more. As she fled the bench, the gavel forgotten, the courtroom dissolved behind her into a low humming confusion. She escaped to her chambers, pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window, and let the years she'd tried to bury rush back, sharp and searing. Outside in the courtroom, Micah sat down. He did not smile. He did not cry. He simply waited, as if he knew that the rest of his life, and hers, was about to begin. And for the first time in her career, Judge Claudia Monroe had no idea what justice looked like. Only that somewhere, in the quivering gap between truth and forgiveness, was the son she'd lost and the mother she'd never dared to be. The hours after that fateful hearing crawled by like a slow-moving storm. Every ticking second seemed to bring Judge Claudia Monroe closer to a reckoning she had spent a decade avoiding. Her official duties continued. She signed orders, presided over unrelated cases, offered measured advice in chambers. But her mind was elsewhere, haunted by the tremulous voice of the boy who had called her Mom in front of a room full of strangers. That evening, when the courthouse lights flickered out and the clerks packed up their briefcases, Claudia remained behind in her office. She stared at the city below, watching car headlights blur into lines, wondering if each driver had their own secret. The shadows in her office crept up the walls, mingling with the guilt and longing she'd carried for so long. She was 19 again, scared and broke, sitting in the dim light of a hospital room, a tiny baby swaddled in her arms. Her parents had been cold, her friends distant. There had been no money, no plan, no hope. And so, with tears streaming down her face, she had signed the papers. She'd told herself it was for the best. He would have a better life. She would never look back. Except now the past was staring her down, 10 years old, full of questions she had never dared to answer. For a long moment, no one moved. The lawyers exchanged glances. Should they object? Should they offer comfort? But even they seemed frozen by the boy's quiet certainty. Finally, Claudia gathered herself, every muscle in her body screaming to run. Micah, she said, her voice trembling with a kind of awe. Sometimes people see what they want to see. I am your judge, not your... But Micah shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. Number, you're my mom. I know it. I know you're the one who left me, but you're also the only one who can tell me why. The room pulsed with a rawness no law could contain. The Delaneys wept quietly. The court reporter's hands hovered, not typing, simply witnessing. Claudia felt the whole edifice of her career, her reputation, her life, everything she had constructed out of order and logic, start to tremble. There was something in her heart, something she had starved for so long, that now ached to reach across the gulf of years and answer the boy's cry. Court will recess, she whispered, not trusting herself to say more. As she fled the bench, the gavel forgotten, the courtroom dissolved behind her into a low, humming confusion. She escaped to her chambers, pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window, and let the years she'd tried to bury rush back, sharp and searing. Outside in the courtroom, Micah sat down. He did not smile. He did not cry. He simply waited, as if he knew that the rest of his life, and hers, was about to begin. And for the first time in her career, Judge Claudia Monroe had no idea what justice looked like. Only that somewhere, in the quivering gap between truth and forgiveness, was the son she'd lost and the mother she'd never dared to be. The hours after that fateful hearing crawled by like a slow-moving storm. Every ticking second seemed to bring Judge Claudia Monroe closer to a reckoning she had spent a decade avoiding. Her official duties continued. She signed orders, presided over unrelated cases, offered measured advice in chambers. But her mind was elsewhere, haunted by the tremulous voice of the boy who had called her Mom in front of a room full of strangers. That evening, when the courthouse lights flickered out and the clerks packed up their briefcases, Claudia remained behind in her office. She stared at the city below, watching car headlights blur into lines, wondering if each driver had their own secret. The shadows in her office crept up the walls, mingling with the guilt and longing she'd carried for so long. She reached for her old leather-bound journal, an artifact from law school days, and thumbed through entries filled with ambition, regret, and hope. So many dreams, so many compromises. Her hands shook as she remembered her own mother's voice, cold, practical, dismissive. You think you can be a mother and have a life? You're barely surviving as it is. You'll thank me someday. Claudia had never thanked her. Instead, she had let the system decide for her. At 19, terrified, she had signed the documents and watched as a nurse carried her son, her only child, out of her life. She had buried herself in work, closing her heart to everything but the law. But the law could not protect her from herself. Now, a decade later, the law had brought her face to face with the very boy she thought she'd lost forever. Claudia unlocked the drawer where the most sensitive records were kept. She pulled out the sealed file labeled Rhodes, Micah, Adoption and Foster History. Her hands trembled as she paged through medical reports, social worker notes, court orders with signatures that made her blood run cold. There it was, her own name, scrawled beneath the heading, Birth Mother. Her eyes filled with tears she had not allowed herself to shed in years. She needed answers, closure, forgiveness, something to make sense of what had happened. But more than that, she needed to see Micah, to speak with him without the weight of the gavel between them. For the first time, she found herself afraid, not as a judge, but as a mother who had no idea what to say. The next morning, before the courthouse opened to the public, Claudia sent a discreet message to Ms. Kendrick, Micah's caseworker. Please bring Micah to my chambers at 8:30 a.m. There are important matters to discuss. Confidential. Her message was careful, official, but her heart raced with every word. At precisely 8:30, there was a gentle knock at her door. Ms. Kendrick stepped inside, her face lined with concern. Micah followed, clutching his battered backpack. He looked smaller than ever, but his gaze was clear, watchful, hopeful, afraid to hope too much. Claudia rose from behind her desk and managed a small smile. Thank you, Ms. Kendrick. Could you give us a few minutes? Ms. Kendrick hesitated, but nodded and slipped out, closing the door softly behind her. For a moment, neither Claudia nor Micah spoke. The silence grew thick, as if both were afraid that words might shatter whatever fragile bond hung in the air. Claudia gestured to the visitor's chair. Would you sit with me, Micah? He nodded and climbed into the chair, feet not quite touching the floor. He watched her with wide, serious eyes. She took a deep breath. Yesterday, what you said, it surprised me. No one has ever said anything like that to me before. I'm sorry if I made you mad, Micah whispered, his voice trembling. I had to know. I always wanted to know who I came from. I wanted to know why. His honesty cut through every defense Claudia had ever built. She leaned forward, tears stinging her eyes. Micah, you didn't make me mad. You made me remember things I've tried so hard to forget. He watched her, patient and silent. Claudia realized how much he reminded her of herself, his stubbornness, his questions, his quiet way of waiting for answers. I was very young when I had you, she began, her voice shaking. I was alone. I had nothing, and no one was there to help. My mother, your grandmother, she said it was the only way. She said you would have a better life if I let someone else raise you. She paused, looking at her hands, ashamed. So I signed the papers. I let you go. I told myself it was for the best, but I never stopped thinking about you. Not once. Micah stared at her, jaw trembling. I found your name, you know, in the papers at the group home. I saw you in court, and I knew. I just knew. I don't know how, but I did. Tears rolled down Claudia's cheeks. She reached across the desk, her hand shaking. I am your mother, Micah, and I am so sorry. I wish I could change the past, but all I can do now is be honest with you. Micah's own eyes filled. I always wanted you to come find me, he whispered. I always hoped. Even when people said I should give up, I hoped anyway. Claudia stood and came around the desk. She knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. You are so brave, Micah. Braver than I ever was. I promise, whatever happens now, I will not disappear again. I will be here for as long as you need. Micah threw his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder. For the first time in his life, he let himself believe that someone truly wanted him. Not as a responsibility, not as a case file, but as a son. They stayed like that for a long time, tears and promises weaving something fragile but real between them. Back in the system. The next challenge came fast. As Claudia composed herself and led Micah back to Ms. Kendrick, the reality of the legal system returned. Judges cannot preside over cases in which they have a personal stake. Claudia recused herself, making the announcement in open court, her voice clear and strong, but her hands trembling behind the bench. I must step aside from this case, she declared, her eyes meeting Micah's across the courtroom. It is not only a legal necessity, it is the right thing to do. A new judge was assigned within hours, but the news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. The attorneys, the clerks, even the bailiffs, all whispered about the story. The judge and the boy, a family split by fate and law, now facing the world together. But Claudia didn't care about the rumors. She met with the Delaney's, Micah's foster parents, and explained everything. She listened to their fears, their hopes, and, eventually, their support. He deserves to know where he comes from, Mrs. Delaney said, her voice thick with emotion. And if you're ready to try, you should be part of his life. The process was not easy. Claudia attended meetings with child services, counselors, and lawyers. She opened up about her past, about her mistakes. Micah began counseling, learning to trust, learning what it meant to have a mother, slowly, carefully, with setbacks and progress in equal measure. They started meeting outside court, in parks, at libraries and coffee shops. They talked about school, about favorite foods, about the emptiness they both felt and the hope they shared. Each conversation was awkward, healing, necessary. Claudia, for the first time, dared to imagine a future where she was both a mother and herself. Micah, for the first time, dared to believe he was truly wanted. A new beginning one evening, as they sat in a quiet park, Micah turned to her and asked, "Are you scared?" Claudia smiled through her tears. "I'm terrified, but being scared means this is real, and I think we're both brave enough to try." Micah took her hand, small and trusting, and in that simple gesture, the years of longing melted away. The journey was far from over. There were more hearings to come, more questions to answer, more wounds to heal, but they would face them together now, as family, not as strangers separated by law. And for the first time in years, Judge Claudia Monroe looked up at the night sky and felt something close to hope. The days that followed Judge Claudia Monroe's confession felt surreal, like living in a story that everyone in the courthouse seemed to know by heart. No matter how many closed doors she passed through, no matter how softly she tried to tread, the whispers found her. In elevators, in quiet hallways, even in the parking lot, colleagues and strangers alike offered cautious nods or outright stares, as if measuring her against the rumors. Yet Claudia no longer flinched from the attention. The only eyes that truly mattered now were Micah's, and he watched her with a mix of hope and fear that sometimes broke her heart all over again. Micah, too, felt the change. At school, a teacher asked gently if he was all right, then sent him to the counselor, who in turn asked if anything exciting had happened at home. His foster parents, the Delaneys, walked on eggshells around him, torn between wanting to protect him and recognizing his need for answers that only Claudia could give. Every day felt fragile, as if the world itself might shatter if he asked for too much, or expected too much too quickly. But the world did not end. Instead, life pressed on, insistent, relentless, hopeful. With the spotlight now glaring, Claudia and Micah's lives became a series of appointments and interviews. Child Protective Services arranged a stream of counseling sessions and supervised visits. Social workers combed through Claudia's records, questioning her fitness as a potential guardian. Claudia, for the first time since her bar exam, found herself sitting across from people whose job it was to judge her, not for her rulings, but for her ability to love, to nurture, to heal the wounds she had caused. She attended every session, answered every question. She did not hide her past, her panic, her regret, her own loneliness. She admitted to feeling unworthy, even afraid, but her answers rang with a new conviction, one she'd never found in the law books. "I am his mother," she told the adoption panel, voice trembling but strong. "And I am willing to work every day for the rest of my life to prove I deserve that chance." Micah's voice, too, mattered. In interviews, he told the truth as only a child can. "I don't know what having a mom is supposed to feel like, but I want to try. I want her to try." His words carried the kind of honesty that turned even the most hardened caseworker gentle. The process was slow, weeks stretched into months. Claudia's judicial career entered a kind of limbo. She finished her remaining cases, but stepped away from the bench for the duration of the review. News outlets circled the story, some with curiosity, others with open skepticism. "Can a judge be a mother?" asked one headline. "Justice, forgiveness, and the law. A real-life courtroom drama," teased another. But none of the noise mattered as much as the work being done behind the scenes. Counseling, family therapy, and, most of all, those tentative, miraculous, ordinary afternoons together. The first weeks were awkward. Claudia and Micah met in parks, at the library, sometimes for ice cream on warm evenings. At first, they talked about school and favorite movies, the weather, books Micah liked to read. Claudia told stories from her childhood, about her love of swimming, about the stray cat she tried to keep secret from her mother, about how she wanted to become a detective before she decided on law. Slowly, their conversations grew braver. Micah asked about the day he was born, about what Claudia remembered. She told him, voice trembling, about the hospital, about holding him for the first time, about the loneliness, about her mother's pressure, about the pain of letting go. Micah's questions turned sharper, sometimes even angry. "Why didn't you come find me sooner?" "Did you ever try?" Claudia answered honestly, even when the truth hurt. "I was afraid. The records were sealed and I told myself you'd be better off without me. I was wrong. I'm so sorry." The trust between them was not instant. There were setbacks, arguments, awkward silences, days when Micah barely looked at her. But Claudia persisted, showing up always, never breaking a promise. She learned his favorite foods, mac and cheese, mango slices, his bedtime habits, 3 books, 1 nightlight, no exceptions. The way he fidgeted when nervous and bit his lip when he tried not to cry. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Micah finally asked, "Do you really want to be my mom, or do you just feel sorry?" Claudia knelt down and looked him in the eyes. "I want to be your mom, not because I feel sorry, but because I love you. I may not be good at it yet, but I will be, if you let me." Micah was silent a long time. Then quietly he reached out and hugged her. For Claudia, that simple gesture was the greatest verdict she could ever hope for. There were obstacles that had nothing to do with the law. Claudia's mother, now frail and sharp-tongued, refused to visit, claiming, "You're ruining your life all over again." Old friends resurfaced with mixed reactions, some supportive, others judgmental. Claudia faced the gossip at work, the wary respect from colleagues, and the silent judgment from those who had always seen her as the perfect judge. But she found new allies too. Ms. Kendrick, who became a fierce advocate, the Delaney's, who offered gentle advice, and eventually their blessing. "You both deserve a chance," Mrs. Delaney told Claudia one afternoon, her voice thick with emotion. Micah faced his own storms. Other kids at school, emboldened by their parents' whispers, sometimes teased him. "You're the judge's kid, huh? Think you're special?" He learned to ignore them, or, with Claudia's help, to answer calmly and walk away. He found solace in art class, drawing sketches of houses and families, sometimes including a tall, silver-haired woman and a boy sitting side by side on a park bench. Therapy helped. It gave them words for feelings they'd hidden. It taught them that anger could live alongside love, that healing was slow and sometimes messy. Together, they learned to forgive, not just each other, but themselves. 6 months after that life-changing hearing, the final review came. The courtroom was packed. Social workers, lawyers, the Delaney's, Claudia's colleagues, even a few journalists who'd followed the story. Claudia sat beside Micah, no longer the judge on high, but just another mother hoping for a second chance. The new judge, a gentle woman with kind eyes, listened carefully as social workers and therapists gave their reports. Ms. Kendrick spoke passionately about the progress they'd made. The Delaney's testified to Micah's growth, and Micah, in a voice clear and strong, said, "I want to live with my mom. I want to try." When it was Claudia's turn, she stood and spoke from the heart. "I can't undo what's been done, but I will spend every day trying to be the mother he deserves. He's already taught me more about courage and forgiveness than I ever learned from the law." The judge's ruling was gentle but firm. Claudia Monroe would be granted custody with continued oversight and support, and the option to finalize the adoption if both chose. The courtroom let out a collective sigh, some joyful, some simply relieved. Micah looked at Claudia, a slow smile spreading across his face. For the first time, the word home didn't feel like a fairy tale. In the weeks that followed, Claudia and Micah settled into a new rhythm. Dinners together, shared chores, laughter over burned toast, tears when memories crept in. Claudia found herself learning the small things that made a family. The right way to fold socks, the ritual of pizza on Fridays, the comfort of falling asleep to the sound of Micah's breathing down the hall. They kept going to therapy, kept talking, kept trying. Some nights were hard, old wounds ache, old fears rise, but always they faced it together. One afternoon, Micah brought home a school project, a drawing of a house, two stick figures on the porch, and a sun shining above. He handed it to Claudia with a shy smile. "This is us," he said simply. Claudia framed it, hanging it in the entryway, a reminder that family is not built by blood alone, but by forgiveness, hope, and the courage to try again. Months later, Claudia returned to the courthouse, this time not as a judge, but as a guest at a ceremony honoring her years of service. Many faces from her past gathered, some with pride, some with lingering doubt. But the only one she cared about was sitting in the front row, legs swinging, eyes bright. As Claudia stepped to the podium to speak, she looked at Micah and smiled. "The law can bring us justice," she said, "but only love can bring us home." The audience rose in applause, but it was the quiet squeeze of Micah's hand in hers that meant the most. No verdict, no ruling, no rumor could erase what they'd found. A bridge between two lost souls, built from truth and courage and forgiveness. And for the first time in years, both mother and son knew they were finally, truly home.